and the subject I'm studying is called the Propaganda Model, Class Struggle, and New Media Technology. It's an analysis of the propaganda model in an age of social uprising and social media. For those of you who are not familiar with what the propaganda model is, I will get to that in a moment. The basic research question I propose is, does new media technology, in particular social media, serve to counter the propaganda function of the corporate media as predicted by the propaganda model, which I will get into here in a moment. Now, I'm going to start with my conclusions and then provide evidence just to cut to the chase. My first conclusion is that the propaganda model remains an effective model in analyzing class bias in corporate media. I'm not trying to discredit the model, I'm trying to test it in a new age where there's new media technology where the tests have not been done. However, I have found a correlative relationship between the existence of new media technology within class struggles and the potential for an empowering of working class people to dictate news coverage and global communications in a mass way. The means of communication seem to be less centralized in the centers of power that own the media, and I see a strong correlative relationship. But I also want to emphasize that it is merely a correlative relationship. I couldn't possibly prove causation. I'm trying to slowly test something in its infancy, which is the impact of social media on class struggle and media output. It would be too much to say that social media can impact media output directly without more testing being done on other important variables, such as the role of class struggle, economic conditions, and even the very structure of the social media and the corporations that own them, which is a whole other subject that I don't delve into. Now, briefly, I will have to introduce the propaganda model, which was introduced in 1988 by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, I understand, is a couple hundred feet away giving a speech, so perhaps you can speak to him for further information. And their aim was to find a way to empirically demonstrate class bias in the media. And they say that this occurs, that the media in the United States provides a propaganda function not as if Pravda would have in the Soviet Union, where there was crude intervention by state leaders, but in a more subtle way where news goes through filters that end up producing media outputs that favor elite interests. These filters are ownership, which is a very significant one. Obviously, mass media communications are owned by corporations with the very same interests of corporate America in general, but also advertising, sourcing, and access to government officials. Something called FLAC, which is a fancy way of saying kind of the retribution the media gets for going outside the acceptable parameters of debate, lobbying groups, public relations firms, and one that was called anti-communism as a national religion, which was more up to date in 1988 and is largely dated now, but there are efforts to adjust it as something more broadly ideological. Now, in terms of international relations, there's a very persuasive way to study whether or not the propaganda model is reliable and effective. In the case where the US media, and I mean, when I say media, I mean agenda-setting functions like the New York media entities like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the network news, etc. The model predicts that US allies will be covered different than US enemies. The crimes of US allies will be downplayed or ignored, and the plights of their opponents will be ignored and distorted. The victims of these leaders are unworthy of coverage, whereas in the case of enemies, the crimes of enemies, Hugo Chavez, Iranian leaders, etc., will be amplified and condemned, and the plights of their opponents will be considered worthy of coverage. And you can test this by using paired examples. So, just to give some contemporary examples, Kevin Young, a PhD student, wrote a very interesting case using a paired example where Hugo Chavez wanted to extend term limits in Venezuela. Also, Uribe in Colombia wanted to do the same thing. He was interested to see if the media would give each of them the fair shake between the two of them, and found unbelievably disproportionate coverage, negative towards Chavez, as the propaganda model would predict, and ignoring the potential abuses of power implicit in extending term limits with Uribe, a US ally. And there's other examples, nuclear proliferation, abuses of democracy in Iran and Honduras, and so on. But for time's sake, I will not go through all of them. Now, what I want to do is factor in the impact of new media technology. And again, that takes me to my research question, which more briefly put is, can the rise of social media change media output? And will user-generated content help democratize the flow of information and counter the propaganda effects that the propaganda model predicts? Now, I use two case studies here, and I'm going to focus mostly on Egypt today. But I also wanted to do the Occupy movement because it was so contemporary and the data was so compelling. The reason I chose these is, in the case of Egypt and Occupy, they both had heavy use of social media in terms of both class organizing and also in spreading information far and wide. Egyptian is also a very good case study because Mubarak was a strong U.S. ally for 30 years. He was, which would make his victims, if you will, those that are violated, the democratic participation in government is violated by his abuses of power, unworthy victims. And also, which I don't have time to get into today, but the role of Al Jazeera is also something that must be factored in because a pan-Arab 24-hour network covering Middle Eastern regimes is new to that region, and it's put a whole bunch of new media scrutiny on Arab regimes. And Occupy is also a good case study because it directly challenges corporate interests. It directly challenges the media structure owned by those very corporate interests, and again, it uses social media. The difference between what I'm studying and the traditional case of the propaganda model is that there's a different variable. The question is not whether or not alone the subject is an ally of the US or if their interests are compatible with elite interests, broadly speaking, but whether or not the role of social media was a factor in coverage of events. So this requires a different type of paired example. One that I came up with would be to test coverage of Egypt before social media was a major factor and after. Now, again, this is not an apples-to-apples comparison. There's too many uncontrolled variables, but we can glean some important information. In the 2005 election of Egypt, which was widely condemned as being essentially a fraudulent election, admittedly their first infantile step into democratic participation, but still a complete fraud according to most human rights organizations and election monitors. There were 13 articles in the month of that election about the event, about the 2005 election. The New York Times was using language calling it a large gain for democracy and liberalism, a major development first and foremost for Egyptian and the emergent political class, which will draw many lessons from this day, first step in the process of democracy, etc. Also of note is Mubarak was never referred to as a dictator in the entire coverage, despite the fact that he actually jailed his opponent after the election, literally jailed him. Never once was he referred to as a dictator. Take the 18 days of media coverage of the Egyptian